Все вы знаете, недавно нас постигла беда. Авария на Чернобыльской атомной электростанции.
In the mid-1980s, long-term failures in safely operating the nuclear plant in Chernobyl, Ukraine, led to the nuclear reactor exploding on April 26, 1986, when a test at low power went out of control. Thousands of nearby residents were exposed to harmful doses of radiation, leading to permanent evacuation. This event was a turning point in history, as nuclear cooperation between Eastern and Western engineers increased, contributing to the Soviet collapse and improving nuclear safety. Nuclear energy in the Soviet Union started in 1955 with their first power plants installed. From there, the nuclear plants in Soviet Russia exploded in number, growing exponentially for a few years before slowing down, with the end of the plan being in 1980 with 18,000 reactors in place. Nuclear fission is the main center of a nuclear reactor, where the neutron hits the atom, exciting it and causing a split which gives off a ton of energy. This energy then turns into heat, which boils water and gives off steam, allowing turbines to spin, and thus give off electricity. The steam also goes through a condenser so that the water can be reused. The RBMK, or Reaktor Bolshoi Mashnosty Kanalny reactor, which Chernobyl used, came out in about 1970, the same time the Chernobyl reactors began construction, with reactors 1 and 2 starting in the same year. The other two reactors were constructed later, with all of them being done by March 1983. The RBMK was flawed though, and it started with cooling water interacting with hot fuel, allowing fragmentation, heavier steam production, and higher pressure. This then could cause a cover plate to detach partially, breaking fuel lines and jamming the control rods needed to keep the reactor under control. In 1985, there was a test of the reactor to see if there was enough momentum in the turbine to run the plant before the emergency power kicked in the case that the reactor failed. But there wasn't, so the operators had to abort before it was done. A year later, the reactor had to partially shut down because of a routine maintenance check, and the operators decided to take advantage of it by rerunning the same test. Anatoly S. Dyatlov, the chief engineer assistant at Chernobyl and the head of Units 3 and 4, had pushed the workers way too far, and they were inexperienced in the field. Many things were going wrong at the time of the test, with the chain reaction making the reactor dangerously unstable. The operators, including Dyatlov, did nothing, though, and kept on with the test. It got to the point where there were only 8 control rods in the reactor, when the minimum was 15, and a ton of other unsafe emergency problems arose, unaddressed by Dyatlov and the others in the control room. Things just kept stacking on top of one another until it finally happened. Reactor 4 exploded, ejecting estimated hundreds of tons of graphite, vaporizing 2 people, and the hot, now incandescent graphite also ejected starts fires that spread wildly. The force of the explosion is sent throughout the building, throwing doors off hinges, opening massive sections of the building to open air, and causing destruction everywhere. Up in the control room, unaware of the disaster before them, the controls weren't responding, so Dyatlov sent 2 trainees to lower them manually. There was no hope for them or the control rods without any protective clothing or anything, so they both got lethal doses of radiation. People unaffected by the rot wreckage were doing everything in their power to contain the infant catastrophe. They all failed because of the carnage inflicted on both the building and the equipment, and they all just received heavy radiation. Meanwhile, the fires were ravaging throughout the plant, unable to be stopped by the workers, so firefighters and medics were called in to help the situation. Those heroes risked their lives, and in most cases lost them, in order to keep the situation from getting any worse than it already was. A memorial was later erected to honor them, and all the lives that they saved. People like Alexander Yevchenko went to turn on coolant water only to discover rubble and destroyed water tanks as well as the light which was coming from the radiation. Yuri Trukov saved him, though, from quite likely death by yanking him out from the line, which just contained high doses of radiation and was highly fatal. Alexander also encountered 3 workers sent by Dyatlov to lower the rods, but probably saved their lives too by convincing them it was senseless to do it. At about 4 a.m., Dyatlov walked through the chaos near the destroyed reactor until he had had enough. He then brought the computer printouts to the plant director, Viktor Bryukhanov, who then allegedly reported in Moscow saying it looked still intact, which cost everyone their valuable time, quite possibly their lives as well. Those who didn't die from the explosion were immediately taken to the nearest hospitals once the fires formed by the explosion were put out. The nearby town of Pripyat was evacuated the day after the nuclear failure. People started the cleanup by pouring about 5,000 tons of a combination of boron, dolomite, sand, clay, and lead on the reactor using helicopters, hoping it would bury the radioactive debris. Soon after, a sarcophagus was quickly constructed over the destroyed reactor in hopes of stopping the radiation from continuing to exude from it. The liquidators were called back almost immediately to clean up the mess that still was Chernobyl, and many of them got even more unhealthy levels of radiation. One of them was Alexander Yevchenko, who later died of leukemia in 2008 at the age of 47, likely in part due to the radiation he received while at Chernobyl. The citizens near Chernobyl were evacuated the day after the explosion, but this would mark a turning point in all of their lives, and a staggering number of people involved in the disaster were confirmed to have severe anxiety, fear, stress, and even PTSD related to fears about the children's radiation effects and possible unknown and unseen radiation effects to themselves. About a year after the explosion, Natalie Dyatlov, Viktor Bryukhanov, and Nikolai Fomin, the plant's main leaders, were put on trial for the management of the plant. They were sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp for Fomin and Dyatlov, and 15 years for Bryukhanov. Sitting President Ronald Reagan had initially offered to help assist with the Chernobyl cleanup, with the U.S. having gone through and navigated the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979. And they did manage to help out in the construction of the sarcophagus. Later, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, conducted a study into Chernobyl, how it was caused, and how to improve U.S. nuclear reactors because of it. The animals were not immune to the radiation, but they were never evacuated. The fish in the rivers and some of the other aquatic creatures had it bad, with terrible mutations. After the collapse, some of the debris fell into the rivers, polluting them and making the life forms use years of their lives and their reproductive speed. Other animals too had it bad, with terrible mutations due to the mistakes of the humans nearby. Not all of the animals had received terrible mutations, however. A study was conducted on the area years after the fallout, where it was expected for their birds to be deformed, like a lot of the other animals. But they were fine. The birds had adapted to the radioactive environment by producing higher levels of antioxidants. There was also a study conducted on the gray wolf population inside the exclusion zone, where it was found that they too were highly resistant to cancer. Research was done on the survivors' children, testing for genetic mutations. After the testing, the children of the survivors were shown to have twice as many mutations as a group of children from Britain. The nightmare that was and still is Chernobyl all started because of cut corners in the reactor design, and kept going because of poor training for workers, and continued because of bad operators and operating orders. The official death toll was 31, but thousands, tens, even hundreds of thousands may have died from the effects of the radiation, all dying terrible, agonizing deaths. At least hundreds of lives were affected, perhaps even millions and tens of millions, even so. Its mark on history will never be forgotten, a turning point in the world, as it allowed Eastern and Western engineers to work together to make sure a nuclear accident, the likes of Chernobyl, would never be seen again, even if nuclear accidents weren't eradicated completely. It also helped to topple the Soviet Union. As Mikhail Gorbachev, a former president of the Soviet Union, even admitted, the Chernobyl accident, its global discussion and disastrous fallout across huge Soviet areas, shattered the Soviet militarized mentality to the core.
Мы впервые реально столкнулись с такой грозной силой, какой является ядерная энергия, вышедшая из-под контроля.